the BARB Biosecurity Forum. So this is a bit of an initiative out of the BGAN's professional group for arboriculture, and we're trying to every quarter just deliver some professional development or support from things within the BGAN's network, things that people have flagged with us they'd like some help on or some advice, and hopefully it'll become a really positive resource for everybody. We're going to record the session for those of you that might be joining us later. Then please feel free to share this once it's out there on, I think, our BGAN's YouTube network. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ian Allen. I'm the convener of the BARB network. And today we're going to have a presentation from Chelsea Payne, who's the curator of arboriculture at Kings Park and Botanic Garden over in WA on Polyphagous Shot Hole Borer. And before I pass over to Chelsea, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the lands from which we're all joining today. I'm in the Australian Botanic Garden down in Mount Annan, and this is the lands of the Darwal and the Darug people. And I always try to mention and make this a bit more personal that, you know, we understand and we acknowledge the deep ancient connection that First Nations people have with trees, and we can see that evidenced in scar trees and cultural trees such as birth trees. And I think it's really important for us as caretakers of these trees and stewards of them that we keep that in our minds and we try and do a good job of looking after the things that were here long before we were. So I guess, but without further ado, over to Chelsea.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in. I'll just share my screen. And can everyone see that? All good. Excellent. So I'll do about 15 minutes and we can have some time for questions or a chat after. I'll keep it fairly informal as an update just on PSHB and the impact it's had on Kings Park and the WA Botanic Garden. We manage 2 sites. Fortunately, it's only impacting one, but also some of the wider response and the impacts on in Perth. So just acknowledging I'm on Whadjuk country today, part of the Noongar Nation in the southwest of WA. I come from Botanic Parks and Gardens Authority, which is the least friendly approachable name for any botanic garden in Australia, but we're in Western Australia, so we have one botanic garden in the whole of Western Australia, that's us, and we're located in Perth. So our main site, if you're not familiar with us, is just over 430 hectares right in the middle of Perth City, and we do also have another site which is another 400 hectares out towards the coast. So we have a number of threatened ecological communities. 2/3 of our site here at Kings Park is remnant Banksia woodland, and we also have the WA Botanic Garden here as well. So we have a lot of things to manage. Just to talk to this first slide, this is a photo which was taken last week on one of our biggest sites where PSHB is being actively managed, and this is me. You can see me to the right of this stump. We're looking very unimpressed. And this was a tree that was removed as part of the PSHB response. So there's a lot at stake. And what we're really trying to do for our colleagues on the East Coast is get the message out, because there is the chance that PSHB will break out of the eradication out of the quarantine area, but there is always the chance of a novel infestation. So for people who might not be familiar with PSHB, I won't go into depth around the actual life cycle of the beetle. However, it's an ambrosia beetle, really large group of beetles that's found throughout the world. PSHB is from Southeast Asia. It spends most of its time living in beautiful tropical rainforest, deciduous forest, where it doesn't actually create any sort of disease in its natural range. We've learnt a lot from colleagues in South Africa and California that have been dealing with infestations for around 10 years. However, it is presenting a little bit differently in Western Australia. So it was first detected in Fremantle, so the port city south of Perth, in August 2021. It's a small borer, so it's about the size of a sesame seed at its largest. The males are smaller, and they are fungus farmers. So they have an associate fusarium with them that they carry their entire lives. They transport with them in little cheek pouches. And as they're boring into the stems, they plant those spores and propagate the fungus for them and their babies to live on. So it creates some challenges in that they don't actually eat the trees. So that's a major hurdle towards chemical treatment. We know that it can infest over 400 species, and we're rapidly adding more and more to the host list every day. We know that it can kill hosts within 2 years, and that's from the fusarium dieback, which is caused by the fusarium it carries. In other infestations, it is Fusarium urulacea, which has been identified. We found that in the West Australian infestation, it's a different holotype. It looks like it's probably a novel infestation from Taiwan, and the fusarium that it's carrying with it in Western Australia is unnamed. So we're also dealing with a couple of unknowns in that situation. There's no known chemical control. There's been a lot of really dedicated research from the US and from California for 10 years. From California and South Africa for around 10 years. And we've been collaborating with those researchers. However, a lot of the treatments that are known are contact insecticides. Many of them are really, really significant health risks to humans. And we're also dealing with a lot of the infestations in riparian habitats, where a lot of those insecticides are also really highly toxic to aquatic ecosystems. So there's a huge desire in Perth at the moment to look for a chemical control. However, people aren't necessarily understanding the impacts of some of those indiscriminate insecticides out there in the environment. Many of them are also banned in other countries. Australia is a little bit behind the times. However, when you're looking at things like bifenthrin, fipronil, emamectin benzoate, many of those are banned in places like the EU. So probably not a long-term practicable solution for control. So the top hosts in WA, box elder maple is the absolute preferred host of this beetle. Things that are closely related to it taxonomically are also very susceptible. In WA, we've got a lot of robinia. Most of the arborists here are actually pretty excited that the robinias are going. Extremely weedy, really nasty to work on, so no great loss. The same as the erythrinas. A lot of erythrinas aren't particularly beloved by arborists in WA. However, they account for a really significant number of our street trees. So we're having suburbs where entire streets of street trees are being removed as part of the control of the pest. Plane trees, so in South Africa, we know that there are areas where up to 50% of their plane trees have been removed or have died due to PSHB. And something that is arising as a really significant management challenge in our inner city parks is the infestation of Moreton Bay and Port Jackson figs. So we're seeing fairly low numbers of individuals that are being infested. However, in terms of the prominence and the canopy coverage of those individuals, it makes a massive difference when we start losing them from the landscape. These are the top hosts in WA. However, we are also looking at a significant agricultural species such as avocados, nut trees. We know in South Africa currently pears are being really heavily impacted. Mangoes, grapevines, a lot of the things that West Australia has as their primary industry are infested by PSHB. And we don't exactly know how it will behave in Western Australia. A quarantine area has been established around the metro area. Currently, that's being monitored, and we haven't had any detections outside of the metro area. So just quickly, in Western Australia, this is being managed by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, which we call DPIRD. They're working under a federal framework. One of the challenges is that this is being managed as an agricultural pest. And so we've taken a significant interest in it in terms of advocating for urban canopy and also natural systems that sometimes don't necessarily get the same level of interest that agricultural systems and primary industries do in Australia. So WA native hosts, talking about the significance of trees to First Nations and that continuing culture. This photo is a photo of one of my guys. We're visiting a Melaleuca raffiophylla, so one of the swamp paperbarks, which is a pre-invasion Melaleuca on one of the lakes in a very inner city area. We know that this tree is at least 400 years old. It's directly connected to 3 traditional owners, one of whom had their grandparents born under this tree. This tree is looking at being removed because of PSHB. One of the things that we can do as a botanic garden is that we're looking at growing seed to propagate for this tree. However, this is kind of what's at stake. Really, really significant losses, both environmentally and culturally. I've also put up some of the WA native hosts. We're starting to see some of our keystone species attacked. Fortunately, about 85% of the native hosts that we've found have been in really highly infested sites where we have a tree with lots of beetles that's dispersing out. So we're hoping that native systems are much more resilient. However, it puts pressure on acting quickly and decisively to remove those trees from the landscape that then are creating more beetles that are dispersing out into our natural systems. So how are we going in Western Australia? Perth already has the lowest canopy coverage of any capital city in Australia. It's pretty dire. We've gone through a really, really hot, dry summer. As I said, when we were catching up before the meeting, we are now having Queensland box trees regularly die on verges in Perth. So really hardy trees are struggling. So we're in drought condition already. We've got a huge building boom in Western Australia, which is impacting a lot of our remnant bushland and also a lot of subdivisions. So we're losing trees from within our cities. And now we have PSHB. So to date, there have been over 2,500 trees removed as part of the response in Perth. We've had an additional 900 trees pruned. This photo here is from Hyde Park, which is one of our inner city parks. And the next 2 weeks, works will start at this site, which will involve a loss of 20% of the trees within that park. So that's 180 trees, including trees like these Moreton Bay figs. So really significant canopy losses coming up. And we have major inner city sites such as the Perth Zoo, Kings Park, Lake Claremont, as I said, Hyde Park, and a lot of the inner city leafy older suburbs are being really heavily impacted. We're also seeing that a lot of the infestations are along those sort of riparian remnant vegetation communities, especially along the Swan River. So really bleak. For everyone out there, we're trying to get the message out with some of the images. So early on, a lot of the surveillance images that we had were coming from especially California, and they weren't necessarily relevant to Australian or West Australian trees. So this is one of the plane trees, which is across from us in the parliamentary precinct. And you can see how many shot holes and weeping holes there are in this tree, and a complete canopy decline. This is one of our marries, so Corymbia calophylla, one of our really significant keystone Corymbia species through the Swan Coastal Plain. Really deep tessellated bark plates, so very hard to surveil, but if you knock the bark plates off, we've got these perfectly round holes. If you then chisel out an area, you can see that fusarium. This is on that same tree. We removed it very quickly. And you can see that fusarium spreading through the tissues and the gallery stained black as well, which is really typical of PSHB. We don't see that in a lot of our other native borers. So this was the first tree that was removed on our site as control. You can see how much has changed in 18 months. So this tree went into dormancy and it essentially didn't come out of dormancy. Unfortunately, this was one of the remnant individuals from the original South African collection that we had, and in a really prominent spot. So this tree is probably about 50 metres away from Gidgijumulu, who is our 180-year-old boab, which was transported from Telegraph Creek in the Kimberley. So really close to a really very significant, important part of our collection. And so again, we're needing to act decisively to protect the WA Botanic Garden collection. So the current site that we're managing is on the Scarp. People, this might not make much sense to people. However, the pink area is an area along Mounts Bay Road, which is one of the significant arterial roads into Perth, has around 50,000 cars pass it every day. Some of these trees overhang that road, and they are at the bottom of this yellow area, which is the WA Botanic Garden. The area all along the road is dominated by self-sown and colonial planted figs and erythrinas. So we know that they're a lot of the top hosts. Everything in red is part of the current management program. So all of those red blobs are canopy that we will lose. We've currently just completed the section on the left-hand side of the image. Within the next 3 months, the red blobs on the right-hand side of the image will also be treated. However, it's reasonable to expect that all of the blue canopy will also be removed within about the next year. So you can see there, so the Narrows Bridge is actually the main freeway that runs through Perth. Very visible site, very prominent within Perth City. This is what the reality of treatment looks like for PSHB. So these were really significant trees, extremely steep grade, and for these chemical treatment is not an option. And so it means removal. These are actually the same trees. They're taken from a different aspect. We're still kind of getting all of our media together. However, you can see how dominant these trees are in the landscape. And this was a photo from last week. So we've removed 1,310-year-old figs from this site in the last 2 days. A lot of that included, we were running 2 crane crews, 2 chipper crews. For a part of it, we had to have a 250-ton crane on site to lift trees off the Scarp. And this particular site is also a really significant Whadjuk site. There's a freshwater spring on site, and some people believe that this is potentially one of the sites where most of the songlines for Western Australia originate. So we're dealing with a really complex site. But you can imagine what hiring a 250-ton crane for a week starts to cost as well. So we're looking at a really significant financial burden for this response. We've taken a self-management approach. We're lucky that we have on-site arborists and knowledge and really fantastic industry connections. It has been a challenge to advocate for tree care in this response. DPIRD have a job to do and they have a mandate, and that's not about caring for trees. There's also, I'm sure, as you're all experiencing, not that many arborists in Australia. So they've really struggled to recruit people with experience into that response. And we're finding that there are a lot of people with operational experience in large-scale biosecurity responses. But there's also people who are riggers or scaffolders or beekeepers who are managing some of these sites and are recommending treatments on trees, which by the book, the right thing to do, however, leading to significant questions around tree care and stability. I've had some really interesting conversations with people around risk and a disproportionate response to perceived risk from stem failure. We deal with that at the best of times. Bringing people in with this heightened pressure then makes that challenging as well. So we've actually upskilled a lot of our contract climbers. We were part of the response from really early on, And so now regularly, it's fantastic. I get photos like this from our contractors saying, do you think this is PSHB? And we're actually being able to triage a lot of things ourselves. There's also a 3-month backlog at the moment for a lot of things coming through DPIRD. So having people on site who are really knowledgeable about the response means that we can actually respond really quickly and care for our own trees. That's cut down on a lot of our secondary infestations where we're stopping infestations at the source. We're being able to prune a lot and not have to remove trees. So our wins have been, we jumped on this really early. We were aware of this through some of the plant sentinel networks, through Plant Health Australia and also through Botanic Gardens. We knew this was coming in the pipeline, and so Amanda Shade, our collections manager, and I, as soon as we saw the notice from DPIRD, got onto this very early. And I think we spent the first year having to convince a lot of so local government authorities, that this was actually a really significant response that they needed to start resourcing. Felt like we were banging our heads against the wall for a long time. However, now, when inner city parks are losing 20% of their tree populations, we've now got people banging on our doors, trying to get in contact with us and trying to work together. So that's been a massive win. We've done a lot of proactive media on this, and it's been really well received by the public. We thought as soon as we started actually having chainsaws run through trees, we were going to have all of the media there. No one turned up. We were all ready to go. We had this massive media pack. But because we'd done that proactive media, explaining to people, having a project page, doing a lot of social media, we actually had a lot of support from the community, which was really fantastic. And again, using our position as Botanic Gardens, which are really trusted agencies, to raise this issue with the community and also assure people that research was being done. There was a proportionate response, and this was considered was a really valuable thing. Often other government agencies don't have that privileged position to be able to communicate to the public in a bit more of a softer or more sensitive or approachable way. So it was fantastic we were able to do that. We also had really fantastic response from traditional owner engagement in terms of what we're going to do with the site next. Challenges, we have a lot of conflicting priorities and a lot of conflicting stakeholder expectations, which have been really challenging to manage. We've been pulled around a lot by different priorities. We're having to manage public perception. And one of the biggest things for Botanic Gardens out there who might be facing things like this in the future or similar threats is how we're managing the workload internally. For me, I now feel like I've got 2 jobs. I'm trying to manage the rest of our tree collection and all of the threats and challenges that come with that, and also almost full-time manage PSHB on our site. And that's because we're wanting to have a hands-on approach. It's really paid dividends in terms of managing our collection. However, you do need to consider the impact on your staff and yourselves when you're dealing with these sorts of responses. Look at funding allocation. We were really fortunate that we put together a fantastic pack, and we've managed to get a $5.6 million Treasury funding for the restoration of this particular site. We were able to lean on the fact that the scarp is actually being held up by the trees. So, you know, that's a good way to scare government into giving you money. However, it really is about managing expectations. In the last month, you can probably see there's a board behind me here, and my weekly goal is to say no to 5 things. So my team has weekly goals. It can be anything from bringing your lunch 4 days a week instead of buying stuff from the cafe. But for me, it's say no to 5 things. And that's about managing my own resources. We've had a lot of inquiries from local governments, which are fantastic. However, we're now saying to them, well, if you want our expertise, that's going to be on a fee-for-service basis. Educate the public. All of these resources are online. I would really encourage everyone to just raise it with their team. Have the flyers on your mess room desk or your table. And one of the things that the West Australian DPIRD team are really insistent about is that they are very happy if anyone on the East Coast suspects that they have PSHB or find something similar, please send it through my Pest Guide reporter. It will go to the West Australians, and if you put PSHB in it, they will triage it straight to that team. They're now very good at diagnosing things from photos, and they are encouraging everyone nationwide. If you do find something, don't think, oh no, this is only for a West Australian service. It's for anyone in Australia, and it's a really fantastic way to get those images through to experts. So that is my presentation, bang on 10 o'clock. Has anyone got any quick questions? I'll send through those resources. It's a quick whip around where I was trying not to be too bleak. Ian, you got your hand up?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for such an amazing presentation, and for taking that time out of such a busy schedule dealing with that, Chelsea. I think the heaviness of what's going on over there isn't lost on all of us people who care about trees and also do the work. So yeah, that's just amazing that you've taken the time out for us on that. And yeah, I think a couple of questions. I'm really interested in that. You sort of touched on it with the decisions around removals over risk or quarantine response. And I'm sort of interested in how that fine line is being walked, and if there's any information that is, being supported by the evidence you're building and the data you're building on, like likelihood of failure in those infected stems. Yeah, could you just maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so there was a photo in there of one of the Moreton Bays which had lost a stem. So we've now had 2 large stem failures. Fortunately, it was on the site that we were treating and was excluded from public access. But both of those were sort of 17 to 20 metre second order stems. The biggest one was probably 400 mil. And they had failed at points where there were really heavy gallery infestations. So PSHB is quite interesting because unlike other borers, so things like longicorns that you often see, they go in and then they'll run up the stem. They stay on a sort of a plane through the stem, and it's a fantastic mechanical way of damaging a stem so it fails. So we've only started seeing that recently in really heavily infested stems. And the top in the Botanic Gardens, we're removing those stems before they get to that point. So we are concerned about that in terms of operational delays. And I'm trying to caution people that for some of these stems, potentially, in figs, they aren't as sturdy as a lot of the ukes that we're used to dealing with. They'll degrade quite quickly. And as a tree manager, the thing that concerns me is that if there is a large stem which fails in a public park and is either impacts someone or is very close to someone, many of these trees are over playgrounds, it's going to be wholesale removal. So there's going to be that backlash where trees potentially with really low infestations, which could be managed through pruning, are just going to be removed, because if it's got PSHB, it's dangerous, it's going to fall apart, it's going to kill everyone. But then the thing that also concerns me is that there is a lot of directed works which are being directed by people who are not trained arborists, sometimes being undertaken by qualified Cert 3 arborists, but under the direction of DPIRD officers who basically in Australia, biosecurity legislation kind of trumps almost everything else. And we're hearing things where they're saying, oh, well, you've got this massive Moreton Bay fig, do a 2/3 reduction on the whole tree so it can be surveilled or managed and you won't have any problems. So we're saying, well, if you start doing 2/3 reductions on trees, you're actually having really significant structural impacts on them. If you're lopping stems, if you're, I've seen trees where they've had half of their canopy on one side completely removed as treatment with no considerations for the structural impacts. And that's happening around the place. They're trying to use spoon cuts where people are actually essentially doing bore cuts into unions to remove all of the galleries and just leaving the trees like that without the consideration of the impacts. So really scary things. I guess as arborists, we all make decisions around where you implement Australian standards or best practice pruning and then the exceptions you make. In these situations, I don't think the exceptions are being made for informed reasons. And there's some I've got to say, in Perth, there's some pretty shocking ARB work that's happens at the best of times. And now we've got councils who want to say to their constituents, we're keeping trees at all costs, but they're not actually considering what those costs are. So, and if you've got an erythrina on the side of the road that's been absolutely butchered and has like 3 little sticks on it, is that really the best approach? So if you want to see some shocking artwork, come to Perth. Matt? Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I was that guy. Yeah, I did it. Firstly, Chelsea, great presentation. I can't help but feel that there was a sense of dread and urgency around it, but I think you're doing a fantastic job at handling it, especially at your site there and spreading the message as best as possible. I think it was really interesting that point that you said that public perception of Botanic Gardens is a trusted authority to kind of listen to. I can understand that, especially working here at Sydney as well. I think that's a really good way of getting the message out to the general public. Just another quick question I had, probably more of a logistic thing and stuff like that. What are you doing with all the waste material? Are you keeping it on site? How do you manage that? And once the tree is gone, is the problem, is it still there? Like, you've removed the tree, but can they continue to continue being alive in that material? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so strictly speaking, the best practice would be to chip all of the material to less than 2.5 centimetres and then solarize it or hot compost it. Simply from the volume of material we have on site, we've made the decision to stockpile it. It is already starting to break down a bit, but all of those trees had to be chipped to less than 2.5 centimetres. So, usually trees like that, you'd kind of get the crane to put it on the back of a hire truck and then deal with it later. All of that material had to be chipped, which we've got some pretty significant mulch stockpiles. And there is data showing that as long as you chip that material to less than 2.5 centimetres, you get 99.9% of the beetles. We know that we're not going to get every single one on that site. However, removing that sort of reservoir of the really preferred hosts is actually effective. There is data from another site, which was one of the really early infestations, which was, so in Perth, most of our inner city parks are based around an ancient wetland system. A lot of them got filled in as rubbish tips, and now they're these sort of low-lying areas in these suburbs. So one of these sites was really heavily just chock full of Aesynagundos that had self-sown as weeds. And I was feeling really bad about our site. And then I went to this site and ran away screaming because there were so many beetles. It was just gross. They had trees on site, so things like Eucalyptus globulus, Poinciana, Casuarinas, Melaleucas, Jacarandas, that we know are reproductive hosts that the beetles can reproduce in. And instead of removing everything, they just removed the aces. And they did 3 rounds of treatment with trapping. And they actually found that those other hosts, which technically are reproductive, started occluding the beetle holes and were able to tolerate. And now in the traps, they're not getting any beetles. So there's good data from that site that if we remove those kind of main reservoir hosts, you can actually then see recovery in the other trees. Trudy Pop from South Africa has also reported that in South Africa, where often they'll find areas where a lot of their native trees are getting hit. They'll do a survey of the area. Often they're old farmhouses. There might be an oak out the front. The oak's absolutely riddled. They take care of that, chip it, stump grind it, and then you see that population drops off. So we're trying to collect data on that. Kings Park Science is trying to lead a lot of research at the moment. DPIRD do not have a research focus. They've got an operational eradication focus. So we're trying to do that kind of in the background to care for natural systems. So once you chip that material, once the fusarium can't propagate, essentially they die off. The females can fly. So the males always live in their natal tree. They can't escape. The females can fly, and the thing I didn't mention as well is that unfortunately for the females, they can reproduce without being mated, and they can complete a life cycle within about 22 days at 24 degrees. So they can turn around a life cycle very quick. So it's about trying to reduce those numbers. We're also playing around with things like trap logs. So getting really stressed out logs from trees that have been removed and sort of mopping up beetles that way, seeing if we can aggregate any kind of loose beetles on those trap logs.
Right. Yeah, I think I saw some of those underneath that Moreton Bay fig there. They'd kind of propped up. You had some signs there. So that's what those logs were there for, were they?
Yeah. So we've had them in the Botanic Gardens as well, and they like the face cut, and then we go through, slice it off, chip it up, keep working through those logs, and that seems to be a pretty good way of mopping up beetles.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Lots of learning to do.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for you, Chels. That was a fantastic presentation. Thanks for that. How is this beetle going to handle orange cold weather? And what about younger trees? Do they seem to handle the beetle or have the same effect?
So we're finding that mature trees are more desirable. Simply, we don't know whether it's a growth rate thing, whether it's a holding capacity or like a carrying capacity for the fusarium. However, we're seeing small diameter stuff being hit all the way down to 2 centimetre diameter. Tends to be trees that are under pressure from some, whether it's environmental, whether it's out of range, all sorts of things. The data from other infestations shows that they only start dying off below 0. And of course, trees are fantastic insulators. If you're a little beetle, you're just going to go in your nice little warm home and wait for that cold weather to pass. So they've got quite a wide temperature range. They will probably slow down because of the fusarium slowing down, but we're seeing early indications here that they potentially have recruited new associates and are now also being able to use a graphium, which has a lower moisture requirement. So in Western Australia, it's really dry, it's really hot. If they recruit another associate which can feed them, which can kind of exist in drier timber, we suspect that potentially they could also recruit things that are more locally adapted on the East Coast.
Thanks for that.
Chelsea, do you think there's any, like with the incursions out of these sort of host trees into some of the native species or even into some less obvious species, is there any indication that drought stress is playing a role in that?
Yeah, we suspect that it is. One of the interesting things is there is definitely a microclimate factor, and probably coming from Southeast Asia, they want to stay in a nice moist environment. What we're finding with some of our native hosts, so the Banksias and the Corymbias especially, they are trees which are in really heavily irrigated sites, and most of the heavily irrigated sites in Perth, I could fairly confidently say, actually have pH issues. So we've got really alkaline groundwater in Perth. So areas like golf courses, like inner city parks, like Botanic Gardens. We love dumping a lot of water on turf, especially. And then we have our trees, our poor trees, stuck in these kind of highly irrigated, heavily modified soils, which are irrigated with with alkaline water. And throughout Perth, we see chloritic decline. So on the East Coast, I think they were always called Mundella yellows. Even here in the park, we have areas where our ground, our soil pH is in the 9s, which is pretty bad if you're a plant. So we're seeing that there is a connection between that chlorotic decline and susceptibility, but also those waterlogged sites for a lot of our species here. Possibly the erythrinas might be under a drought stress. One of the other factors is we do see that a lot of the more deciduous trees are impacted, sort of anecdotally. Even some of our native deciduous trees, so our busias and our native erythrinas, they are less tolerant of this. So,
Yeah,
but
thanks.
definitely those sort of cultural conditions, we're advocating again in terms of restoration, diversity, both in genetics and species, but then also healthy ecosystems. We just know that they're much more resilient. We haven't found any of this in Kings Park bushland, and I've been looking.
Yeah, I'll bet you have.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks, Chelsea. Has anyone else got any questions for Chelsea? If not, or if you think of any wonderful ones later, or if you're watching this on the recording, then you can absolutely get in touch with us through the BARB network and BGAN's webpage, and I'm sure we'll be able to help. But I think in the recording, you'll see those resources that Chelsea has put up there, so you should be able to access all of those. And I guess I'll also ask Chelsea too, just is there any way that, you know, you think the BGAN's and the BARB network can help support you? That's what we're here for, even if it's just a chat, you know, and knowing that there's people out there to bounce things off and have a chat. But if there's any action we can take that can support you, you know, even if you don't know right on the spot, absolutely there for you on it all.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think actually one of the things that I've sort of lent on a bit was we had a chat at the Botanic Gardens Congress, and I've since had a chat with Dale from Brisbane around, you know, as tree managers, it's I think often different to horticulturalists because we deal with a smaller number of individual plants, and we know them personally. That's kind of one of the really nice things about being an arborist. You actually get to develop that personal relationship with individuals. But then I guess one of the things that BARB, I guess, going forwards is supporting people on how we deal with disasters, you know, how we deal with cyclones or fires or biosecurity threats that come through and not just knock out collections, but knock out individuals, and how we all kind of support each other through that. I know, like, I'm lucky that I've got a team of people here, so we can kind of lean on each other, but I know that a lot of people in the network don't. They might be the only tree person in their city or their organization. So how we kind of keep supporting each other through what is going to continue to be a challenging time. You know, we were talking about extreme weather. It's managing those kind of those mental and emotional impacts, I think, is something that as a group we can definitely focus on. So
yeah, great. Well,
not the end of the world.
No, it's not all doom and gloom. And as Matt said, you know, from what we can see, you're doing an amazing job. And I think that response, the multi-agency approach, all this different expertise that's there to be called on, it sounds like it's going to be a great model for if this or other pests become issues in the eastern seaboard or over in New Zealand, you know, just like the myrtle rust work, just like all these other things. I think we're all stronger together in all those different places we can call upon. And certainly some of these bigger capital city botanic gardens doing this heavy lifting for everybody. It's really great. So thank you very much.
Awesome.
So Nico, I noticed you just joined us. Welcome. Thanks for joining halfway through. So yeah, this is going to be recorded. Well, it is recorded, and we'll put it out on the BGAN's YouTube channel. I think Rebecca, that's where it'll be, and we'll send out links to that as well in BGAN's news.
Yep. Friday. I'll try and get it done by Friday. Otherwise, next week. Yeah, but I'll send a link to you, Ian, and you can circulate it amongst BARB even if I don't get it in the e-news, because there's a lot of other stuff happening too.
Yeah,
I just hope we don't see it over here, Chelsea. We need to build a wall.
Sure. I know, we need to do COVID 2.0, but the other way, just keep the state closed for another 2 years. But again, if people see anything that is unusual that they're concerned about, just get in contact, because now we are pretty good at spotting it and understanding also other things that look similar. And I know, the West Australians have really benefited from all of the just tireless work, research, outreach on myrtle rust. So we were actually now really prepared for that. And so we can repay the favour.
Lovely, thanks. I'm going to turn the recording off now.
Great, thanks, Rebecca.